I'd never been to the cabin before. It was way out in the woods, far from any main roads. My stepmom thought it would be a good way for us to get closer or whatever. I didn't care much for the idea. She'd been in my life for a few years now, and while she wasn't the worst, I didn't really like her. But this trip wasn't optional, so here I was, sitting in the back seat of the car, staring out at the thick trees swallowing the sky as we drove deeper into the woods. The cabin was small, with no neighbors, no self-service, nothing, just trees all around, and a heavy quiet that made me feel alone. The second we stepped out of the car, my stepmom was excited though, saying it was a nice break from the city. I didn't feel the same. Something about being out here made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. That first night wasn't terrible, just quiet. Way too quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to every little creak in the cabin and the wind outside. I could hear every single noise. It took me a long time to finally fall asleep. The next day, we went on a hike. I wasn't really into it, but my stepmom was set on exploring. I stayed close to her, not because I wanted to, but because something about the woods didn't feel right. It was like we were being watched, even though we were completely alone. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The trees seemed to close in around us, making it darker, and the path was hard to follow. I wanted to turn back, but I kept going, hoping the weird feeling would go away. It didn't. At some point, my stepmom slipped on some loose rocks and twisted her ankle. She tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but I could tell it hurt a lot more than she let on. I offered to go back and get help, but she said we could make it back together. So we started heading back slowly. As we walked, things started to feel different. The trail didn't look right. Stuff I swore I saw on the way in was suddenly missing. The trees looked different, like the whole forest had shifted. The feeling of being watched came back stronger this time. My stomach tightened. We kept walking, but the cabin wasn't showing up. It didn't make sense. We hadn't gone that far, and we were following the trail just as we had come. But something was wrong. Every step seemed to take us deeper into the woods, not closer to the cabin. My stepmom was limping more now, leaning on me to keep moving. The sun was starting to go down, and I could feel panic building in my chest. We had been walking for hours, but we weren't any closer to getting back. The shadows around us were growing longer, and the trees seemed like they were closing in. There was no sound, no animals, no birds, just the crunch of our footsteps and the sound of our breathing. I realized then that we weren't going to make it back before dark. My stepmom's ankle was really bad and she could barely walk. We needed to stop, maybe start a fire or something to wait it out. But there was no phone signal, no way to call anyone for help, and I didn't know how far we were from anyone else. We found a tree to rest by as the last bit of light faded. My stepmom tried to act calm, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew something was wrong too. It wasn't just her ankle. Then I heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes. At first I thought it was an animal, but it didn't move like one. It was slow, like something was sneaking up on us, moving carefully just outside where we could see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to move. But I couldn't stop myself. I glanced over, but there was nothing there. The noise stopped, and everything went quiet again. Dead quiet. We didn't talk. We didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. For a long time, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw something far off between the trees. There was movement, quick, almost too fast to catch. I saw it. Someone or something was out there, watching us. My stepmom tried to get up, wincing from the pain, but I didn't know what to do. The cabin was somewhere out there, but the woods didn't make sense anymore. We were lost, and something was out there with us. We didn't wait around to see what it was. We started walking again, faster this time, even though her ankle was clearly hurting more. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever was out there was following us. We didn't talk. We didn't stop. We just kept moving. By the time it was completely dark, we finally stumbled on the cabin. It didn't make sense. It wasn't where it should have been. The forest had twisted around us, or maybe we had. But there it was, sitting in the dark like it had been waiting for us. We rushed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind us. But even in the cabin, the feeling didn't go away. It was still out there, whatever it was, just beyond the trees, lurking, watching, waiting. That night we didn't sleep. We didn't talk. We just sat there, wide awake, listening. I kept thinking about how we got lost. How the cabin wasn't where it should have been. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to find our way back. Maybe we never really left the woods. Maybe it's still out there, waiting for us to step outside again. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and just wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpacking trip, just the 2 of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to that point was when a little black bear crossed the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't really doing much to calm my nerves. My boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones, sheath hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, and bear spray strapped to his waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was uphill in bear country. You're supposed to make noise so as not to startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on it. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound pack makes it very difficult to have a full-on conversation. An hour in, and almost at the top of the ascent, I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream to our left on the trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. This usually indicates predators are nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we hadn't said one word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time and exchanged knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me, in the middle of the trail, was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of while still in my frozen stance. I managed to take my arm and start flinging it wildly behind me to get H's attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting to standing on all fours, never looking away from us. It quickly swung around so that I was behind it, and it started to growl. Being in the military, H knows how to yell, but this grizzly wasn't fazed. It began to walk slowly towards us. I was on the verge of passing out from terror. The bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack come from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too and bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, but this time it was much closer. H said it was probably just some falling branches, but we both knew that wasn't the case. At that point, we were walking quickly up the trail, attempting to create distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment, H stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned around to look behind me. To this day, we're still not sure what we saw. Back where we were just previously standing was a large, black-brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly bear we had just seen a few moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that's exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. Eventually, the footsteps faded. At this point, I was a complete mess. H was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're gonna be okay. I'm sure that won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on this backpacking trip. Not an hour later, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we had sat down, I noticed the brush moving in a line toward the clearing, directly toward us. Now, out from the brush, came this adolescent grizzly, who looked just as spooked as I'm sure we did, but it came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming and readying the bear spray. Thankfully, that did the trick, and the bear ran off. All I could think was, just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened. The second night, before we began our backpacking trip, we'd let the ranger station know which trails and route we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point to check on you to make sure everything is okay. There weren't many approved trails left for us to choose from, so it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we'd been the sole hikers. We didn't see a single person once we were on this route. Anyhow, I guess somehow we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We'd been following hoof prints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my bootlaces and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or two left of daylight, and in the woods it gets dark fast. I was completely exhausted, and it was now dark out. H was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine wouldn't even turn on for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp, still needing to eat, and it was freezing. The wind was blowing, creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, making it difficult to hear H or discern any other sounds from those woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we finally found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be 200 meters in diameter, with the sides around 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange, and we both felt it. Though H didn't tell me how freaked out he was until after we'd left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead or fallen just inside this bowl, while the vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, H started playing Ninja Sex Party out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much, as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought it would ward off any predators nearby. This is when we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at that clearing. It might have had something to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. It was freezing, and as soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line, falling trees. There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain that season. Both of us froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing, definitely not a fallen tree. We heard another thud. It came from right outside our tent this time. We both stopped breathing. A's hand found mine, and we clung to each other, paralyzed. Something dragged across the front of our tent, making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know," H said. "It shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle my sobs, trying to listen to what was outside, but I couldn't decipher what it was. Steps, but they stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was pushed slowly inward. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside. I shined my flashlight on the side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and an open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. "F that," H whispered. He pulled a Glock from his sleeping bag and cocked it. The sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading toward the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent until the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed when we got outside of our tent was the smell of urine. Coming out of the tent and looking around, we saw that whoever it was had peed on our coals we'd left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. The prints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. Well, we think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife isn't the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. I was sent out for a solo night shift. The call came in about a cabin way out in the woods, miles away from any main road. The dispatcher said something. Someone reported hearing strange noises, maybe an intruder. It seemed like a routine call. I drove out there. The cabin was sitting in the middle of thick trees. It was completely cut off, with nothing but forest and silence all around. The air was cold, and the light from my car barely lit up the trees. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I could feel it. This silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like something was off. My breath felt loud in the air. I turned on my flashlight and slowly walked toward the cabin. It was old, falling apart. The door was closed, but didn't seem locked. As I reached for the handle, I stopped. I heard a soft creak from inside. It wasn't loud, more like someone moving, but trying to stay quiet. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, showing me the small living room. There wasn't much, just an old couch, a small table, and some dusty shelves. No sign of anyone. I moved carefully, checking each corner. My heart was beating faster now. The air inside felt stale, thick. I went through each room, but I found nothing. The windows were all shut, and it seemed like no one had been there for a long time, except for one thing. A faint sour smell, like something rotting. I figured it might be a dead animal, but something caught my eye. The rug in the middle of the living room looked slightly out of place, like someone had moved it recently. I bent down and pulled it back, revealing a hatch, a small wooden door set into the floor. It wasn't locked. I froze for a second, then lifted it. A narrow set of stairs led down into a basement. I pointed my flashlight down, but it barely lit anything. The smell got stronger as I walked down each step, creaking under my weight. At the bottom, the air felt damp and hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered as it moved across the room, showing a dirt floor and wooden beams. Then I saw it. Piles of dirt, like something had been buried there. In the corner, a rusty old shovel leaned against the wall. I stepped closer to the dirt piles, my heart racing now. That's when I saw it. A hand, half buried in the dirt. It was pale, lifeless, fresh. The skin still looked new. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Someone had been buried here recently. I rushed back up the stairs, slamming the hatch behind me. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Nothing. I stepped outside and the woods felt even worse, like they were closing in on me. I hurried back to my car, but as I reached for the door, I stopped cold. The driver's seat was covered in blood. The car had been locked when I left it. No one had passed me in the woods. I stood there, my mind spinning. Whoever buried that body wasn't gone. They were still out here watching me. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the car slowly, pulling out my gun, my eyes darting through the trees. But the silence was back, the strange, heavy silence that told me I was alone, and at the same time, not alone at all. As I stood there, I noticed something on the ground by the edge of the forest. Footprints. Fresh ones, heading away from the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't leading deeper into the woods. They were circling around. Whoever it was, they had been watching me the whole time, following me, and they weren't done yet. I realized then I wasn't getting out of these woods. Not alive, anyway. It was 1996, and I took a short trip to the German countryside. I rented a small cabin far out in the woods, away from any towns. The cabin was simple, old, with wooden walls that creaked when you walked. The air outside was chilly and damp, but inside, once I lit the fire, it was warm enough. I didn't really have any big plans, just wanted to relax, maybe take a few walks in the forest to clear my head. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading and walking the narrow paths around the cabin. The forest was thick, and if you didn't pay attention, you could get lost easily. I didn't see many animals, just some rustling in the bushes now and then, or a bird flying by. On the third night, something felt off. As the sun started to go down, a heavy fog rolled in, covering the trees and making everything around the cabin disappear. It felt even more lonely than before. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about the quiet started to bother me. There were no usual sounds, no wind in the trees, no animals moving around. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep it off. But as I lay there, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a soft, scratching sound from outside. At first, I thought it was a tree branch against the cabin, but the noise didn't stop. It was steady, sharp, like something was dragging across the wood. I tried to ignore it, but it just kept going. It sounded like it was right outside my window. I sat up, straining to hear. The scratching changed to a light tapping, like someone or something was touching the window, feeling it out. I felt a shiver run through me, but not from the cold. I didn't move. My heart was racing, but I stayed frozen in place. The tapping went on and on. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like it never would. And then, all of a sudden, it did. The silence that followed was worse. I lay there, tense, expecting something else to happen. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly. But after a long while, there was nothing, just the thick, heavy quiet of the fog outside. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the window, waiting for the sound to come back. But it didn't. When the first light of morning came, I finally got out of bed. I felt uneasy, but needed to know what had been making that noise. I walked over to the window and looked closely. There were thin lines on the glass like something had scratched it. I knew then I wasn't staying another night. I packed my stuff quickly and stepped outside. The fog was still hanging around, making the whole place feel strange. I was ready to leave, but when I walked around the side of the cabin, I froze. In the dirt right under the window were deep tracks. They were uneven and strange, nothing like anything I'd seen before. Too long and narrow to be from any animal. I knew my heart was pounding. I didn't want to figure out what it was. I grabbed my stuff, threw it into the car, and got out of there, without even looking back. I never found out what made those sounds or left those tracks. Part of me doesn't want to know. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the soft tapping at the window, like it was waiting for me to come closer. I always wonder what would have happened if I had. Would it have come inside, or was it just waiting for the right moment to get in? In 2010, I was a freshman going into my sophomore year in college, and my brother Martin was still in high school. We have 2 younger siblings, so at the time, they were in elementary school. My parents decided to take a cruise for their 20th anniversary that year, so my brother and I were voluntold to watch our younger siblings, Cole and Charlotte. My brother's best friend, Christian, stayed with us for a while they were gone, and helped us plan fun activities for the younger kids. One idea they were particularly excited about was a camping trip, as our family had never been particularly outdoorsy in the past. Their eyes lit up at the prospect of cooking our dinner over a campfire and fishing in the stream. Since it was early summer, we were lucky enough to have warm but not too hot weather, with a beautiful, clear sky for stargazing. After getting everything packed and ready for the somewhat long drive into the mountains, we checked into our campsite just before dark. Cole and Charlotte helped us set up the tent. It was strange. There were no other people at the campground, which was kind of unusual for this time of year. Once we finished dinner, my younger brother and sister were ready for bed. So, Martin, Christian, and I stayed awake a little longer, catching up and getting things ready for the next morning. Suddenly, a white Astrovan pulled up to the camping spot right next to ours. He had dozens of other spots to choose from, but chose to park right next to us. "Oh well," Christian said, "at least we have some company now." We waved a quick hello to our new neighbor, but got no response. I immediately got an uneasy feeling, but decided to push it aside and continue getting the fishing poles ready for the next morning and putting the food away for the night to ward off bears and wild animals. Over the next hour or so, things started to get weird. The man parked next to us got out of his van and sat at the picnic table. With only the small fire from our roaring campfire, I could see that he was looking directly at us. However, his fire went out completely a few minutes later, and he just continued sitting there. I could feel him staring, even though I could no longer see his face. He was just sitting there, breathing. Christian and Martin noticed I was beginning to get uneasy, and they picked up on how creepy the situation had started to become. Martin then whispered, "Why is he breathing like that? I don't feel safe anymore." I told Christian and Martin that I was going to stay awake because I didn't trust this guy. As soon as they moved from the fire into their tents, the man rose from the picnic table and started moving towards us. I called out, "Hello," but there was no response from him. In a rush of panic, I demanded that we immediately pack up and go home. Christian and Martin got out of their tents and saw the figure of the man just standing there, staring at us, breathing hard. We tried to stay as quiet and as calm as possible while packing up, so as not to alarm Cole and Charlotte. Finally, throwing everything into the trunk, we drove away without looking back. Before leaving the site, I asked if we could go to the check-in area at the lodge to see what was going on and if they knew anything about this guy. But to my surprise, no one was even registered at the campsite. The story doesn't end here, though. About 6 months later, I was in my sophomore year at school when a local hiker went missing in a county over from where we camped. She was doing something so normal, just hiking with her dog. Sadly, she turned up several months later, murdered and found in a white Astro van. When the news finally released photos of the van and the man's face, I knew it was the same man we saw that night. I got a phone call from both my brother and his friend. They recognized him too. We came to find out that this wasn't his first murder. Several years later, he had been known as the National Forest serial killer. I sincerely mean it when I say that I'm an incredibly cautious camper now because of this encounter. Thinking it could have been us or my younger siblings still gives me nightmares to this day. Recently, we had a reunion, Christian, Martin, and I, and we talked about what happened to us more than 10 years ago. It's amazing that we all remember the details, as they are all etched into our memories forever. So to the creepy, heavy-breathing would-be serial killer, let's never, ever meet again. Thanks for listening. If you've stuck around this far, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'll keep this short because I'm going to keep rolling along and make the next episode, which will be out tomorrow or Saturday, and will be Halloween related. Look out for that, and I'll see you in the next one. I always loved going to my grandmother's cabin. It was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and far from the noise of the town. Out there, it was peaceful, a place where I could breathe and clear my head. Every summer growing up, I spent a few weeks with her, helping around the cabin, going on hikes, or just sitting on the porch watching the trees sway. But this summer felt different. Maybe it was because I hadn't been back in years. Grandma had passed away a couple of years ago, and the cabin had been empty since then. I was the only one in the family who still cared about the place. My parents wanted to sell it, but I convinced them to let me keep it. I wasn't ready to let go, so I decided to spend the weekend there by myself, just to be in that space again. When I arrived, everything looked the same. The old rocking chair still sat on the porch. The air smelled like pine trees, and the wind rustled the leaves like it always did. But there was something off this time. It wasn't obvious at first, but it grew on me. Maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making everything feel too quiet, like something was missing. Even the birds weren't chirping, which was strange for a place like this. I shook it off, thinking I was just overthinking things since it had been so long. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, airing it out, and putting things back in place. By the time night came, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, looking out at the dark forest. The trees were completely still, and the only sound was the creaking of the porch under my chair. It should have been peaceful, but the quiet started to bother me. The cabin never felt this lonely before. I went inside, locked the doors, and decided to go to bed early. The cabin grew cold as the night went on. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to fall asleep, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin, but then I heard it again, and this time it was clearer. Footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone was trying to walk quietly on the porch. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin had no curtains, so I could see the faint moonlight coming through the windows. Shadows of the trees outside moved gently, but there was something else moving too, closer. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I lay there, hoping I was imagining things, but then I heard a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the door. My chest tightened. No one should have been out here. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived, and the nearest house was miles away. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I crept to the door, heart racing, and looked through the small window. In the dim light, I saw movement, but it was hard to make out what it was. Something, or someone, was definitely out there. I backed away from the door, unsure of what to do. The scraping sound continued, louder now. I thought maybe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I moved quickly to the back door, the one that opened into the woods, and quietly unlocked it. The cold night air hit me as I slipped outside, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin, away from whatever was out there. I didn't have a plan, but I knew staying inside wasn't an option. I moved through the trees, trying to stay low and quiet. The forest felt different, heavier, like the darkness was pushing in on me. I could still hear the scraping in the distance, but it was fading as I moved farther away. I found a spot between some thick trees and crouched down, listening, trying to calm my breathing. I waited there for what felt like hours, my body stiff from the cold and fear. The noises from the cabin stopped eventually, but I didn't move. I was too scared to go back. I waited until the sky started to lighten with dawn before I worked up the courage to return. When I got back, the front door was wide open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I stepped inside cautiously. Everything looked the same, except for the front door. It had deep scratches across it, long and rough, like claw marks. But no animal could have made those. They were too perfect, too intentional. There were no signs of anyone around, no tracks, nothing. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my stuff and left, not looking back at the cabin. I haven't told anyone what happened that night, and I haven't been back since. The cabin is still in my name, but I'll never go back. Whatever was out there that night, it knew I was there, and I'm not sure it was ever planning to leave. It felt like it was waiting for something. Maybe it still is. I was 12 and 13 at the time. My friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late-night walks. This was the basis of a terrifying encounter that stopped us from ever sneaking out into the dark again. My friend lived across from a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice for our sneaky adventures. We always took flashlights, food, and blankets so we could camp out for a couple of hours before going back home. On this fateful night, however, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake. When my friend suddenly jolted me awake, it was past 3 a.m., a lot later than we normally ventured out. Groggy but determined, we grabbed our essentials and crept out the back door into the cold, dark night. Frost crunched under our feet as we crossed the deserted road and reached the forest entrance. The pitch-black darkness and eerie silence were unnerving. We turned on our flashlights and stepped onto the uneven path. The light illuminated the swaying trees, and the icy wind bit at our faces. As we walked, fallen, sodden leaves and bark shifted beneath our feet. Our cold breaths were the only sounds interrupting the deafening silence. Eventually, we reached the small hut we had built one afternoon out of sticks, our makeshift shelter for camping out. Though vandals or other kids occasionally damaged it, the hut usually stayed intact. But on this occasion, it was completely destroyed. We decided to call it a night and return the next day to repair it. Just as we turned to leave, we heard it. a loud, shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "What was that?" I whispered. The eerie, unnatural giggle rang out again, piercing the silence and sending chills down my spine. "Someone is in here," my friend whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The calm rationale in her voice somehow made it even scarier. We stood frozen for a moment, then bolted. Our feet pounded the familiar path, guided by muscle memory as we ran. Our breaths came in uneven gasps, punctuated by the sound of the giggle, which seemed to follow us, getting closer and closer. Our flashlights bounced wildly, illuminating random patches of trees and bushes. Finally, we saw a sliver of light from the forest entrance. Bursting out into the open, we didn't stop running until we reached the back door of my friend's house, collapsing in a breathless heap of relief. But then my friend's eyes went wide. She nudged me and pointed a shaking finger toward the yard. At the forest entrance stood a haggard woman of indeterminable age. She was giggling that same awful, horrifying giggle and waving us back toward her. We screamed and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. From my friend's bedroom window, we peeked out through the smallest gap in the curtain. The woman was still there, staring straight at us as though she knew we were watching her. Even worse, we could tell she was still giggling, that hideous, appalling laugh. Slowly, she turned and walked back into the forest. We never went back into that forest. Nor did we ever sneak out after dark again. I had been in the Army for 5 years, mostly doing routine patrols and low-risk missions, when I was assigned to a search operation in the mountains of Montana. It seemed like just another day on the job. The mission was to find a criminal who had been on the run for months. His trail led to an old cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The landscape was rough, but the plan was simple: find him, arrest him, and take him in. We moved slowly, knowing he might be armed and dangerous. The thick trees and heavy bushes made it hard to see far ahead, but I stayed focused. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. As we got closer to the spot marked on our maps, a strange feeling started to creep in. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like I was hyper-aware of everything, like the woods were alive and watching us. The cabin appeared as we reached the top of a small hill. It was old, barely standing, but there were signs someone had been staying there. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, and fresh tire tracks were in the dirt. My stomach turned as I looked around. Something felt off. We moved in, rifles ready, as we approached from different angles. I stayed low and made my way around the side to get a look through one of the windows. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture thrown everywhere, broken glass on the floor. But there was no sign of the man we were after. My heart started racing as I realized he might not be alone out here. I kept looking around, moving carefully toward the back of the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. A row of shallow graves behind the cabin, each one marked with a simple wooden cross. There were at least a dozen of them lined up in a messy row. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. None of this had been in the reports. Who were these people, and why were there so many graves? My radio crackled, but I ignored it, focused on the graves. I inched closer. As I got near the first one, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of clothes. Children's clothes. Torn and dirty. This wasn't just the hideout of a wanted man. Something far worse had happened here. I took a step back, trying to understand what I was looking at. That's when I heard the cabin door creak open behind me. I spun around just in time to see someone run into the trees. Without thinking, I took off after them, my breath coming fast as I crashed through the bushes and branches. Whoever it was knew the woods better than me, slipping between the trees like they had done it hundreds of times. The chase felt like it went on forever. My legs burned and my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. I had this feeling deep down that, if I lost them, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, the person disappeared over a ridge. I slowed down, moving carefully. When I reached the top, I saw what looked like an old bunker hidden underground, almost invisible with the way it blended into the surroundings. The door was slightly open, and that uneasy feeling crept back over me. As I got closer, I peeked inside, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The bunker was full of supplies, food, water, guns. But that wasn't the worst part. On the far wall there were pictures, dozens of them, all of missing people, some of whom I remembered seeing on the news. In the middle of the room there was a big map on the wall, covered in red marks. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at, but then it hit me. These were grave sites. Dozens of them, way more than what was behind the cabin. This guy had been doing this for years, and no one knew. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, raising my weapon, but it was too late. The man we had been hunting stood there watching me, a sick grin on his face. He had been leading us the whole time, making sure we fell right into his trap. The last thing I saw was the flash of his knife as it came toward me, everything going black. When they found me hours later, I was barely alive. The man was gone. Vanished into the woods like he had never been there. But the graves, they were still there. We found more scattered throughout the forest, each one a reminder of what he had done. They never caught him, and every so often, more people go missing in those woods, their bodies never found. Maybe he's still out there, waiting, watching, ready for the next group to come searching. Several years ago, my friend Sean, Melanie, and I got really interested in geocaching. They had a new GPS unit that they just had to try out, with all its fancy features and light-up buttons. We did a few local caches to get the hang of it, then decided we could totally handle the expert-rated tough ones. This led us to northeastern Connecticut, an area called the Quiet Corner. There isn't much civilization out there. Just a lot of wooded roads with houses spaced widely apart and hidden among the trees. It was an overcast and misty day, which added to the isolation we felt from the world. We arrived at the first cache, which was in the middle of a one-way bridge. The bridge connected two causeways over a wooded pond and had steel guardrails. The cache was attached to the rail by a magnet, dangling out over the water. It took us about 20 minutes to find it. During that time, a car driven by a disheveled older man drove by 3 times. The first time, we noticed him because he looked unkempt. The second time, we figured he was lost. The third time, we got chills down our spines. We had just found the cache, and our thoughts quickly changed from, hooray, we win, to, let's get the hell out of here. Unfortunately for us, this was what's known as a multi-cache. You had to find the first one, which gave you coordinates to the next, and so on. The next cache was a few miles away, and we were more than happy to leave our current location. We arrived at the second location, which was deep in the woods near the Rhode Island border. We were very close to a state park, and being on the border meant even less civilization. We got out of the car and searched along an abandoned rail line to find the cache. While we were in the trees, we heard a single car go by and headed deeper into the woods toward the cache. This one was easy to find. As we returned to our car, a vehicle approached from the direction of the border and began to slow down. It was him, miles from where we'd last seen him. He had clearly been the car we heard earlier. Serious concern set in. Who was this guy, and what did he want with us? Thankfully, there were a few houses nearby, so he drove off. We assumed that whatever he was planning, he wasn't going to do it in front of witnesses. We decided to plug in the next set of coordinates and take a very roundabout route at high speeds, hoping to lose him. Sean is a bit of a maniac driver anyway, so you can imagine the whiteness of our knuckles as he kicked it up a notch. I swear, if I ever find myself needing a getaway driver, I'm calling him. After a while, we all figured we'd lost him. When we reached our next destination, a remote section of the rail trail miles from the previous locations, there was no one behind us, and no signs of anything remotely human except our own car. The road, once paved, had turned to dirt. It was just us, the trees, and the fog, which had settled in thicker on the drive over. We got out and felt like we were finally safe. We began to walk into the woods and had gone maybe 100 feet when we heard the sound of tires on gravel. Quickly, we darted off the trail and hid in the bushes. It was him. His car seemed to take an eternity to pass as he slowly inspected our vehicle. Finally, he drove away, disappearing around a bend in the road. Knowing we only had a short window of time, we ran for the car, got in, and tore off in the opposite direction. Fortunately, my brother-in-law's parents lived nearby. Although they were away on a cruise, we pulled into their long driveway and hid the car behind some shrubbery. Now, a bit about Sean. He's a huge guy, about 6'3", with hair and a beard that make him look like Hagrid from Harry Potter. He wears trench coats everywhere and is a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. For fun, he likes to read passages from the Necronomicon. He can be very intimidating to those who don't know him. As you might expect, his car trunk was full of bizarre supplies. A baseball bat, several cleavers, a screwdriver fashioned into an embalming hook, and various rusty cast iron hatchets. His car was essentially a one-man traveling horror show. Once we'd hidden the car, we all armed ourselves with items from Sean's trunk and waited. About 5 minutes later, our stalker returned. He drove by 3 more times in the next 10 minutes. After what felt like an eternity, but was really only half an hour, we decided he was probably gone for good. We finished the geocache, which actually had some cool prizes in it, and never saw our stalker again. That was probably for the best. Sean is very protective of Melanie and would probably have gutted the guy on the spot. Still, it was the creepiest experience of my life. I came across the cabin while hiking through thick woods. It was an old, run-down building, barely visible through the dense trees. The place looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten for years. The wooden walls were faded and gray, the roof weighed down with moss, and the windows were covered in dirt. Something about it made me want to check it out, even though a small part of me felt uneasy. I decided to go inside, thinking it might be a good place to take a break. As I got closer, the air around the cabin seemed different, heavier. The front door made a loud creaking noise as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like old wood and rot. There was a wooden table in the middle of the room with a few broken chairs around it. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for who knows how long. I stepped inside, leaving clear footprints in the dust. As I moved deeper into the cabin, I noticed that the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars. They were covered in dust, just like everything else, and it was hard to see what was inside them in the dim light. I wiped the dust off one of the jars and saw that it was filled with something that looked like dried plants. Another jar held what appeared to be small animal bones, brittle and fragile. Suddenly, I heard a creak from the floorboards. I froze. It didn't come from where I was standing. My heart started to race as I turned around to look behind me, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, just like when I had walked in. I told myself it was probably just the old wood shifting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to ignore the uneasiness crawling up my back, I kept exploring the cabin. There was a narrow staircase leading to an upper floor. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed up, the wood feeling weak and ready to give out. The upper floor was just as dusty and abandoned as the rest of the cabin, with an old bed pushed up against one wall and a large wooden chest in the corner. The chest caught my attention. It was big, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. The lid was heavy, and I had to pull hard to open it. Inside, I found a pile of old, moth-eaten clothes, some yellowed papers, and a small metal box. The box was locked, but the lock was rusty and weak. I managed to break it open with a few tugs. Inside the box were old photos, black and white, the edges worn and curling. The photos showed people, families, couples, children, posing in front of the same cabin I was standing in. The clothes they wore were old-fashioned from a long time ago. As I flipped through the photos, I noticed something strange. The same man was in almost all of them, standing in the background, his face partly hidden or blurry. He was always there, watching, but never clear. A cold shiver ran through me as I realized that the man wasn't part of the families in the photos. He was just there, like a shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the last photo in the stack. It was a picture of the cabin taken from the outside, and there, standing at the window, was the man, staring out with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. I slammed the box shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there. Something was wrong with this place, something dark. I rushed down the stairs, almost tripping in my hurry. As I reached the bottom, I noticed that the front door, which I had left open, was now closed. The unease in my gut turned into full-blown fear. I yanked the door open and bolted out of the cabin, not looking back. As I ran through the woods, I felt something behind me, something cold and unrelenting. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the cabin, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I finally dared to look back, the cabin was hidden by the trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about those old photos, about the man who was always there, lurking in the background. I never went back to that part of the woods again, but the memory of that cabin and the man in the photos still haunts me even now. Every so often, I feel like I'm being watched, even when I'm sure I'm alone. Sometimes when I'm in the dark, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, but it's enough to make my heart race. I know it's probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that the man from the photos is still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm terrified that one day I'll turn around and see him standing there, in the background, just like in those old photos. And this time, he won't be blurry. He'll be real. And he'll be right there, watching me with those empty dark eyes. I didn't expect my weekend to turn out like this. My neighbor Sam invited me to his cabin for a few days. We weren't close friends, but we got along fine, and I thought it would be a nice break. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. Cell service barely worked, and the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals. The first day was normal. We fished at a nearby lake and chopped wood for the fireplace. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire inside, I started to feel uneasy. The darkness outside felt oppressive, like the trees were closing in on us, as if the forest was alive and watching. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me, but as the night went on, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I barely slept, waking up at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The next morning, Sam suggested a hike deeper into the woods. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't want to seem scared of a few trees. We set out, following a trail that twisted through the dense forest. The trees were so thick in some places that it felt like twilight, even though it was the middle of the day. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following us, but there was nothing. We reached a small clearing after about 2 hours. Sam wanted to keep going, but I was done. My nerves were shot, and all I wanted was to get back to the cabin. We turned around, retracing our steps. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail looked different. Trees that should have been familiar felt out of place, and some turns seemed sharper than I remembered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired. Then we reached a fork in the trail that we hadn't passed before. There were no signs, no markers, just 2 paths going in opposite directions. Sam didn't seem worried. He shrugged and picked one, saying it didn't matter which way we went since both should lead back to the cabin. But deep down, I knew we were lost. The sun was sinking, and the woods were getting darker. The sounds around us changed too. What had been the peaceful hum of nature now felt eerie, like something was moving in the shadows, just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, to focus on finding our way back, but with every step, my anxiety grew. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the cabin again. I felt relief as I saw the familiar shape through the trees, but that relief was short-lived. As we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The cabin looked different, older, more worn down. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. We had locked up before leaving. Sam pushed the door open. The inside was cold, much colder than it should have been with the fire we had left burning. Everything was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, and there were deep scratches on the walls as if something had clawed at them. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the faint creaking of the floorboards. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was in the cabin with us, something that had been waiting. Without saying anything, Sam and I grabbed our things and headed for the door. But as we stepped outside, the reality of our situation hit me. The woods were dark. the trail impossible to see. Even if we could find our way back to the car, we were miles from the nearest town. We were trapped, alone, in the middle of nowhere. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too afraid to sleep or move. The minutes dragged on, the air thick with fear. I kept my eyes on the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. Nothing ever happened. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, I made up my mind. We had to leave immediately. We packed up what little we had and left the cabin without looking back. As we reached the car and drove away, the tension started to ease, but it never fully went away. Something had changed in those woods, in that cabin. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never talk to Sam about it. Some things are better left forgotten, but I know I won't forget. I'll always remember that feeling, the certainty that something was out there watching, waiting. And I'll always wonder if it's still there, in those woods, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the safety of the trail. The worst part? Sometimes, late at night, I can't help but think that whatever was waiting for us didn't just stay in that cabin. It might have followed us back. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. It stayed quiet, and I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, something harmless. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, trying to calm myself down, but then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees again. Nothing, just darkness. But then, as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones circling my campsite. My blood ran cold. These weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around me while I sat by the fire, watching me. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been out there, maybe still was, watching the whole time. My heart was pounding. I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as fast as I could. I wanted out of there. But then I heard it again. Those footsteps. And now they weren't just coming from one direction. I could hear them all around me. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out how close they were. Whoever was out there, they were close, and there wasn't just one of them. I could feel the eyes on me from the dark, just outside the reach of the firelight. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my stuff and started heading down the trail. My flashlight shook in my hand. I could hear them following me. Not too close, but close enough to make sure I knew they were there. I walked faster, then started running. The footsteps kept up with me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road. Before I pulled away, I looked back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached, were a few dark shapes. People watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath. I thought about reporting it, but I knew better. No one would find anything. I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from some fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. And what's scary is those people out there, they knew the woods better than me. They weren't just watching me for fun, they were waiting. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. And what's worse is, I got away. But I have no idea how many others didn't. I've posted this on another thread back in August, but I figured I'd share it again. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, for only a few seconds, that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can, and sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes that means walking in pitch dark with a low-light headlamp, and it gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under a canopy of stars more nights than I can even count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trails, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand. I've heard, seen, and smelled everything this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened around 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for maybe another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed until sunrise, and I was on mile 5. I was in a low bottom that was wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush with young maple and old oak growth. I was focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, completely zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack, and I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. At 4:30 in the springtime, it means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze when fight or flight kicked in. You have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself in silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came, fast. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice? That meant get the hell out of here. To describe it as best as I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree, more a fungal bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack, not a thud or a thump. I've described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense it was about 50 yards directly in front of me. It was loud and it was clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move toward the noise, I was going to have my back turned to it and get up that ridge. And that made me very nervous. My head somewhere between a methane murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes passed. I just breathed my foggy breath into my glasses and listened. Still nothing. Still dead quiet. I've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes until first light. I cranked up the headlamp and started to slowly creep toward the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail, and this definitely didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. Then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter, and this was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made it to the top of that ridge, I was huffing and the first light was showing. But I didn't stop until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, especially with leaved-out branches, makes a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I just don't know. I was camping alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. I had been doing this for years, and I always liked the quiet at night. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It usually made me feel calm, but this time something felt different. I couldn't tell why, but it just felt wrong. It started just before sunset. I was setting up my tent when I noticed how quiet the woods were. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. At first, I shrugged it off, but as the night went on, the silence started to bother me. I built a fire and sat by it, eating my dinner. That's when I began to feel it, a strange feeling like someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. It was just darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head. I was out here alone, far from anyone. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I figured I'd feel better after some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, trying to relax. But every little noise outside sounded louder now. Every twig snapping or leaf crunching made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like animals. The sounds were too slow, too careful. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, just outside my tent. They stopped right next to me. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. There was nothing but silence. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away slowly, fading into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shined the light into the trees, looking for any sign of what or who had been out there. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no proof that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. My heart was still racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely taking time to think. I threw my stuff in the car and sped off, not looking back. I never figured out what or who it was that night, but sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet place, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and heavy. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night. Maybe it's still out there, waiting in the dark for me to come back. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brewfest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55. Looking for an off-grid camping spot, we drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared, walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small, with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no. She was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting, more seriously each time. My girlfriend, sister, and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually, we told her we had to leave and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m., my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and toward our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp, and then I heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, I slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, carefully poked my head out with my gun, and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, it was a full-grown buck, horns and all, standing there, staring at the embers of our fire like it was trying to warm up. I was relieved, but decided to scare it off. I hit the wall of the tent, half out of the doorway, and yelled, "Get out of here!" To my shock, the deer just turned its head, looked at me, and then back at the fire. It didn't move. I tried again, louder and more animated this time. It slowly turned and started walking toward me, which was extremely unnerving. Deer are usually scared of people and don't approach them. At this point, I was really freaked out. It was a big buck. I quickly got back in the tent, zipped it up, and just waited. The buck walked up to the tent, and I could see its silhouette from the firelight on the tent wall. It stood there next to the entrance to my tent for a good minute or two, then continued snooping around our campsite. Eventually, it wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different, a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I hardly got any sleep, but around 5 a.m., I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek, calling out, "Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired and because it was so creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later, calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, the really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while. But there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A whole head of brownish-gray hair, like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning, after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer, or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate, took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. I was always close to my sister-in-law, Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together. So when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town. The drive up was nice, with the trees growing thicker as we went deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, right by a small clear lake. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing night. The first night was calm. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too tired to stay awake. But the next day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. First, it was small stuff. The sounds of the forest seemed too quiet, like the usual rustling of leaves and animal noises had stopped. Then, as we sat by the lake, I noticed footprints along the shore that weren't ours. They were fresh, leading out of the water and disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to Sarah because I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They were big, too big to be a normal person. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Later that night, as we sat by the fire again, I heard something in the distance, a low, deep sound like a growl. It was faint, but it made me freeze. Sarah didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, she didn't react. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear far off in the woods. But the feeling that something was wrong only got stronger. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed louder, closer. I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkness, listening, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard it again, the growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent. They were slow, careful, like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy breathing, deep and rough, like something big was just inches away. I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too scared to move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out of the tent. The ground outside was messed up with large prints pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tent back into the woods. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could, neither of us saying a word to each other. We left the campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us looking back. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew something had been out there, something watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but we never went camping again. The fear of whatever was in those woods, of what we might have run into, was enough to keep us far away from the wilderness. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, that breathing, and wonder what was out there. What if we hadn't left when we did? What if it had decided to come into the tent? I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what could have happened is enough to keep me from ever going back. But the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake. Whatever was out there came from the water. Now, every time I see a quiet lake, I wonder what might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to come ashore. I've always liked the peace of camping. Being out in the wild by myself makes me feel free. This time, I planned to camp for a few days alone, so I found a quiet spot near a small lake deep in the woods. The only sign of other people was a tent set up a few hundred yards away, a man I had met earlier who called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a bit older, wearing faded camouflage clothes. He mentioned that he used to be in the military, a retired commander. The first day went by without any trouble. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water, staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened. So, I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite, calling out, but there was only silence. That's when I noticed something strange, a small patch of disturbed dirt not far from his tent. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, but the dirt had been hastily covered up. My heart started to race, and I felt panic rising. But I tried to stay calm. I found a stick and started to dig. As I cleared away the dirt, I uncovered a shallow pit. Inside were a few items: a knife, a worn dog tag, and a notebook. The dog tag had a name on it I didn't recognize, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. I flipped through it and saw page after page filled with notes about survival skills, old military missions, and strangely, entries about this very camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It described how he'd been following a man who matched my description. It talked about how he was planning to eliminate the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too close to mine. His paranoia, his obsession with this mission, had made him believe I was some kind of enemy. I froze. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, too close. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. My mind raced. He was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment. He might have been ex-military, but something had clearly snapped in his mind, and he decided I was the enemy. I didn't stick around to find out what he planned to do. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my camp. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up at any moment. But he never did. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the rustling leaves in the wind. I left the forest that night, driving non-stop until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty pushing him to complete a mission that never existed. As I lie awake at night, I can still picture him standing by the lake, waiting. I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target, or if one day he'll track me down again. I know I should forget about it, but there's something in the way he looked at me, something that tells me this isn't over. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's the truth, that he's still out there searching, and that I'll never truly be safe.